So, yeah, question was there, yes.
Yeah, I'd love to ask a question in part also because I might have to duck out around 8 o'clock. Maybe in the spirit of the idea that the point is not merely to understand the world, but to also change it. I was thinking about corruption in a way that mostly wasn't talked about today, but I mean, it was touched upon and it got towards this. And that is the kind of everyday discourse of corruption here in Bosnia, one that emerged with some strong articulation in and around the protests last year. And so my question is in part because we have people here who themselves deployed that term on television, in the radio, etc. The degree to which that is a socially shared discourse that makes possible certain kinds of mobilizations. I don't know how many people are familiar with Laclav's attempt to recuperate populism for the left in his book on populism, but he makes this claim that certain discourses make possible a separation of society into those that are the enemy and those that are not the enemy. And it struck me that corruption was a discourse in Bosnia that did that, and it made possible a certain kind of populist mobilization. But I'm curious to ask some of the people here who took part in that what they thought both the possibilities of corruption as making possible mobilization, but also what the limits of that are. It certainly seemed to make possible the demand for resignation, but was it enough to sustain, to have that affective investment that Laclav says is necessary to sustain a social movement beyond merely demanding the resignation of somebody? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't take part in the rest, so.
Well, it doesn't have to be that, but I mean, imagine a similar one. I mean, this is fairly strong discourse that allows a lot of people to invest their own individual complaints into it and to mobilize around it. So the possibility I see, it's the limits that I'm also interested in thinking about. How far can you go with that discourse?
It's not necessarily, corruption as it was narrated in the so-called public sphere, I don't think. It's only if you look at corruption the way I was looking at it, what we're talking about, But I think the other is to do with, the mobilization. I don't know, I would say that it's not necessarily to do with discourse on corruption. I think it's really to do with extreme violence and prohibition and the boundaries that people decided to just manipulate. I think that's a lot more important question than discourse on corruption. Because there were, in the end, that was, in terms of mobilization, I think that was relevant. I think what was really important is the fact that people finally decided that actually certain things are not only certain acts, certain types of action, certain types of mobilization are not only acceptable, but actually absolutely necessary. Now, of course, how far this is taken, that's a different question. So that could be explored as a matter of limits, but it doesn't take us away from the question of corruption. But I think, we ended up with this proposal that we somehow address this notion of violence and the reluctance to take up violence. And I was thinking since then that this distinction that Genet introduced when he was writing about George Jackson and Black Panthers and Angela Davis. And it's really interesting because he used the distinction for other situations as well. He made the distinction really is between brutality and violence. I'm not sure how useful it is in this particular position of violence to do with jokes as well. And Gene's statement basically is that a mother teaching a child who doesn't necessarily be taught is in fact enacting violence. The police does, or the state does, is actually brutality. And this involves not just the physical violence, but involves all types of violence, structural violence, and I need to go on. But in terms of, for me, this is, goes back also to the protests in London, the peace march, and why is it that we end up in these situations where we have created this critical mass of people in numbers, but we are still holding back. We are so polished by all these narratives that we are holding back and not doing what we should do.
I mean, I think on the question of violence, I mean, in a sense, the question is who gets to define what violence is. So from the standpoint of the state, it's very useful that violence refers both to violence against property and also to violence against persons, right? Because it's a useful equivocation for them, if you see what I mean. Like most, we would absolutely, in general, radically refuse this equivocation, right? So there's an obvious difference if I, throw a brook through your car window and if I punch you in the face, right? So on some basic level, we understand the difference between these two types of violence, right? But when we say violence, it refers at least to those things in an ambivalent or ambiguous way, from the standpoint of the state. And of course, then you have the question of the spectacularization of violence. So if you have a protest that, quote unquote, turns violent, right? Again, that ambiguity comes into play. So it could be someone throwing a book through a window, and then it gets reported, and then you're in this double bind of well, if we have a protest, then do we make it a bit violent in terms of not hurting people but hurting property, because then it will be reported, right? Or more likely to be. Or do we not? And I think something like the riots, rather than the anti-war protests, which there were very few arrests in 2003, the riots where you have a deliberate refusal of the law of exchange or one thing, in terms of looting, and also kind of widespread property damage, right? And this is painted as the most violent thing, right? These are violent criminals allegedly, right? But that's nothing compared to kind of the violence of the every death, or the violence of taking someone's disability benefit away and leaving them to die, right? Or the violence of poverty, the violence of colonialism, So the problem is we don't get to define what violence is. It seems to me we never get to say, no, it's this. It's not what you say it is.
Yes, but this is perhaps something we should take upon ourselves to talk about, because one thing that I thought was very problematic about the protests is the response from just looking at Facebook comments, but also the media. A lot of people whom I expect slightly different response from were condemning the violence. It's okay to protest, it's got to be super peaceful. You can't burn buildings down.
Right.
And I think that's precisely what should have been done. And this is the most important point to be made. A break through the car window, it only actually achieves the branding of the creation, the construct of this violent protest. But burning down a symbol such as the HDZ headquarters or the cantonal buildings, that actually is a very strong message. So in a way, what I'm thinking is that we really have to start of that. It's being done. We have to think about this and really claim certain acts more thoughtfully, more practical, but more.
Just to kind of link to this, I think it was important for us definitely to take charge of defining this violence during the protest and not to give up on that possibility. I think that was corrupt government. There is something creative about it. They put it very precisely, the creative dimension of violence through that. That's one thing. The second thing is it's escaping now. There's something. I'll get it.
It's probably also worth remembering on this issue of what gets defined as violence that, at least here in terms of what everybody said, there was a widespread fear that property wouldn't be the only thing that was attacked, and that it could get out of control. And I've talked to half a dozen people that thinks it's
Yeah, but it's really interesting that it didn't happen, especially in Moscow. I remember speaking in Moscow to some people in Moscow about the whole thing, and they were saying to me that the place was absolutely chock-a-block with violent young men, and that nothing, and there was not a single incident. And Moscow is even more dangerous than this.
Well, actually, the most amazing thing is the nobody died during the measures. And that's something remarkable from this perspective.
Serious injury.
Yeah, no serious injuries, nothing. That's the most remarkable thing, I think, about protests. That's the second thing I was going to say.
I was just on this thing about corruption and the limits to discourse around corruption. I don't know what people think about Badu, but here's this piece about democracy and corruption when he uses it. He uses the term corruption as a kind of, he clearly thinks it has this capacity to, using that term as sort of politically useful, and he doesn't say it's limited in a certain way.
How does he define it?
He basically sort of looks at the way people have talked about specific politicians being corrupt, and he sort of says, well, no, democracy as it functions in terms of whether the individuals are corrupt or not, in terms of it functioning for the purposes of business or sort of under a specific economic model. For him, it's a kind of
It's corrupt.
democracy. The essence of democracy is corruption. In a rhetorical way. But he thinks of this discourse that it can be used, and it's important, not just specifically sort of these individual politicians, but for thinking about what a different democracy would be.
I think it's interesting the weight and the level of that term, because obviously it's not, a pure concept, in multiple ways, but it's not a kind of philosophical concept, straightforwardly. So it's kind of interesting about how we might deploy it in different registers, I guess. As a theory, as a concept, then do we need a clear conceptual definition? How does it relate to, I guess, other questions of political theory? Do you know what I mean? It's now a term that sort of sits unevenly.
Yeah, it's interesting, but also I think that, one of my big problems with the word corruption, various notions of it, various definitions of it, various attempts at conceptualizing it, is that it always invokes this very moralistic viewpoint. And in a sense, I would actually argue that that sort of propositional statement includes democracy as well. So I think it can continue. And it's almost as if corruption in a way is this fictive layer that really had to be unmasked, or has to still be unmasked, because it actually is a means, even the discourses are a means.
Yeah, although I have just realised that it is a founding aspect of Western philosophy, because of course Socrates is accused of corrupting the youth. And I don't know what the Greek is, probably someone would know.
Aristotle uses it about language.
Yeah, but the charge when Plato describes
Whether it is actually, whether
well, I just said it was Greek,
the issue is whether they actually use that.
yeah, but it's translated as corrupting the youth.
To Latin,
Yeah, it's just kind of a disagreement. So maybe it's a kind of foundational philosophical term in a strange way, or it's the disruption of the term within philosophy, I guess.
And Locke would say that for the purposes of mobilization, you purposefully leave it loose in its definition, because that way it can be the umbrella under which a whole set of resist defining it in super specific terms for the purposes of mobilization, precisely, so that it can be a blanket or an umbrella, which variety of things. I mean, I remember seeing, I don't want to start bringing up individual instances, but I guess I will. You know, the people chanting before they burned the building down, of course, they were shouting thieves, and corruption. And when down here in England, when on television, people were asking, why is this happening? Corruption was one of the keywords that was employed as a way to kind of make sense of and legitimize that anger and that set of actions. So clearly it has that kind of potential.
Just come back to this with this piece of the Badri piece, the critique of democracy in terms of corruption makes sense, but then his thing would be, but what you need in place is some kind of new political idea that isn't democracy, that can kind of mobilise in place, and he calls it communism or something like equality. I'm giving you called this confidence and equality, and the way you describe the plenums are sort of embodying this kind of equality against corruption, and this kind of new idea or political idea was embodied in those. So the plenums weren't just about corruption. They weren't just negatively about corruption, but they were also about some positive.
Because
Corruption
corruption
is something as well.
Yeah.
corruption is like its opposite.
Is what brought in the inequality. This is why I kind of keep skirting away from it, because it seems to me that corruption constantly masks all these really basic and really important issues to address.
Well, which I think is very important to make between the corruption and the commons. I mean, the attack, on the commons, and we started talking about the social space, and the presupposition of a particular type of property that's not as social property as part of self-management, which has the most beautiful definition: it's everybody's and nobody's.
Yeah.
So it was just this kind of it was this kind of impossible property that had to be destroyed.
Yeah, it's bizarre because on one hand it's impossible, on the other hand, when you look at all the basic documents which are meant to guarantee certain rights, life itself, this really is the basics. That's why I said you get born, you come into this world which is everybody and nobody's, and corruption is that process or the umbrella for all processes which actually are telling you that this is not so. You do not have the right to enjoy the space, the air, the grass, the things.
Talk about one instance when we went to Pita for the first or second time. I don't remember anymore. We were talking to some of the workers, and I think you mentioned to them self-management as a possibility. One guy said, that's a thing of the past, we can't do this anymore. And then 3 other guys stand up and say, why not? Why is this impossible? We belong to the company, we do not belong to anyone. But that's one of those instances that I thought was amazing for me to hear him say that. And another thing we mentioned today, white corruption, so it kept buzzing from my mind when I was working at the Center for Security Studies in Sahel. They were writing a policy brief which they were going to present to the federal parliament. And that brief was about the possibility of introducing logging into the parliamentary procedure, which had one point sticking out: if all of this fails, then some financial incentive might also be. And they presented that at Parliament. So, I mean, this is quite.
I think they needed yet another
Mm.
mechanism. Well, I suppose they need another industry.
But yeah, I guess that's all this fetish about anti-corruption in the NGO scene, because they're like, yeah, the project has to do anti-corruption on any sort of level, and if you don't know what to do with it, then go with it.
Right.
comment on, and that was that corruption, as it operates in its various meanings, is very much associated with war and post-war period. It's definitely, when we talk about corruption, talk about war and post-war, we don't talk about socialism under that discourse. But what happened during war and post-war here in politics, in particular in political economy, three key things were absolutely instrumental, and that was humanitarian aid, reconstruction aid, development aid. And in all three of them, you have the logic of corruption and privatization being kind of seeped into the pores of society. And I think the kind of diagram where you have humanitarian aid, development aid, corruption and privatization is very useful, particularly because, for instance, the international authorities used to blackmail local authorities that they will not get reconstruction aid unless they privatize. Before that, you know what happened with humanitarian aid and how much of it was given to the war profiteers, because there was no other way for the UN,
That's
for
what
the
I
UN forces to say anything to the civilians. So about 70 or 80% of it was basically producing the capital for wars or tycoons or the new elites. So
this is the basic rationale
Yes.
of aid. Development aid, this is the basic.
But it operates also in the most dire of circumstances. And actually, I was reading this article a few years back, Christine Sylvester. It was something, the case study was in Africa, but basically she at a certain point criticized our government a little bit and gave it her own twists. In the context of development aid, she was talking about homicide or their life as labor, actually, as labor in power. Which I thought was really productive. That their life is like this kind of, and several of us made it.
I'm sure
This was the first one I in 2000 already, 2001, as soon as it was published and the first discussions were started.
But the other thing to actually really understand is that when we say development aid, we really have to understand that we're not actually talking about aid as such. Whereas humanitarian aid might in fact come in the shape of grants, development aid comes in the shape of loans. And that's a huge...
Humanitarian aid does not come in shape of humanitarian aid was a disaster. So humanitarian aid is what comes during the war, etc. Immediately after the war, then it was no longer called humanitarian aid but reconstruction aid.
Okay. In any event, these are generally not...
I mean, these are the official discourses of the... making examples of this is how NGOs and international organizations use it. I know it's like...
Everybody talks about that, but in the end, it's not. You are actually saddled with loans, you actually have to pay back. So they blackmail you to take loans from them, and then to enter into relations, production relations, let's call them, which will make it almost impossible for you to pay those loans back.
Yeah.
That's basically what I was kind of trying to talk about today as well. And the reason why I was using confidence in effect, Dean and people like that, because they are at the forefront of this game. And they are everywhere. And also because this just paints so clearly the image of the whole system. This is really what happens.
I'm now thinking what we have an opportunity to do here. I remember us talking a few months back and thinking about analyzing all these keywords and mapping out this corruption. We have an amazing opportunity to really examine the war as this some sort of a rupture that enabled a particular type of privatization mode to kind of speed up. And in that, there is a big potential for the critique of transitional justice, and I think that's being carried out now, not least with this kind of separation, humanitarian, like human rights approach to looking at war crimes and separating the entire line of financial crimes that went to one side that never got tried, but they just got focused.
It's interesting because I know they were trying, but when I was covering the Hague, there was one completed. Louisa was talking about it, not much publicly, because we used to meet up with her. She was actually saying that one of the key things to learn is to start digging as deep as possible into the money jobs. So she picked all of that in the end. Somebody just put a very quick stop to that. There was even talk of corporations and organizations. I don't know if they've ever happened, possibly at last.
I was just thinking,
Oh, sorry, you asked me something.
I was just really briefly just going to say, I mean, like it's not surprising at all, but the discourse of corruption is not one that's really used in Britain against the ruling elites, right? Against ruling elites. So, like, if the left are talking about elites, like the discourse of corruption, even though it would be completely appropriate, is not one that's used, right? Because it's always used about, Putin's Russia, or, Bosnia, or, failed references, like, so from the perspective of this, but...
Failed totalitarian.
Right, so...
They do use it, but they use it for things that's interesting, like, money laundering. I don't know.
No, but I mean, corruption is used, right? I mean, it's used by politicians again, of course, like you were saying.
But I know in terms of the discourses, what they actually use, it's always some kind of euphemism when they talk about political influence, when they talk about, expenses.
We use the word cronyism a lot.
Yeah, cronyism.
Actually, but that's used against the British government as well. I mean, it's obviously an insanely corrupt system. I mean, it's like hundreds of years of corruption, but it's established corruption, so then it becomes something else, right? I mean, that's why you need the Badiou claim. What?
Gets a nicer name.
Yeah, right. But that's why the Badiou claim about, democracy is corruption is like kind of crucial, right? It just cuts through that thing. I mean, corruption was, the bankers, totaling the economy and never being held to account. There's the state bailing out the banks. It's all of those things. It's like the same families being the ruling class for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's like, the kind of nepotism and reproduction of class privilege, which happens, every second of every day.
Yeah, it's actually becoming much more apparent than it's in Corona.
Yeah, no, Britain is now the most socially unequal country in the entire Western Europe. For whatever that means, right? But it's, stuff.
I think quite a bit actually, think about it.
Yeah.
It's staggering. We've gone below what 92 was. We've gone below the living standard in 1992. This is like a few years on.
I try to make what I'm saying make sense, but I also will be simplifying, but also might not make any sense, but I'll try. It seems kind of like you're trying to, and my doubt is that is this rhetorical strategy of expanding or radicalizing the term corruption with the hope that that the critique of corruption will then turn into a more radical kind of critique. If we think of, if we kind of displace the word corruption, then the critique of corruption might become a more radical kind of demand or a movement. But I think it seems to me like the opposite strategy might also make sense, which is to see the limitations of the word corruption as the sign of the limitations of the movement as it is possible at this historical moment, and the kind of contradiction. There is a contradiction in a lot of the cases where corruption is the center of the movement. Like just a really arbitrary example, like Burkina Faso last year, another basically vassal state where there is a revolution.
Where France installs corrupt leaders in order to be able to exploit.
Right. And actually, so the interesting thing about it is that, everyone in Burkina Faso knows who was behind Blaise Compaoré, but the revolution is getting rid of Blaise Compaoré. It doesn't strike at France directly. It's only getting rid of the corrupt official, even though everyone knows that the corrupt official is just the point of contact with a much broader thing. And like, especially even with the IMF, like everyone in Burkina Faso knows, because of Thomas Sankare's speech about the IMF, which is famous there, that the IMF, that having debt to Western countries, that post-colonial debt is the means of control whoever is in charge of the country.
So
But yet it had this limit.
Is there a narrative which says, right, we get new authorities in, they tell France to fuck off, tell IMF to fuck off, because we have nothing to lose. End of story. I mean, and this is why, I totally agree with you, there are limits to, and it's important to explore the limits of corruption, but unless you actually really unmask the masking process, you end up exactly in that situation, because you're just getting rid of one corrupt official, whereas the whole system, which breeds officials like him, is going to continue staying in place.
But the problem isn't that people haven't grasped the true nature of corruption. They know. So there's no point in trying to expand the word corruption to include this more radical demand. The question is why, even though people already know that there's a more radical problem, why the movement has to remain on a local level.
Maybe they're scared because the last few times a political leader in Francophone-controlled Africa tried to get rid of these agreements with France. They ignored it. I mean, maybe that's why, Maybe they're worried, just like, look at Greece.
Yeah.
How terrified they were of the chaos that might ensue if they do the Brexit. Yeah?
I just wanted to pose a few ideas which just crossed my mind, and it refers to this, relates to that. Because I was thinking, okay, but the corruption you're talking about, it's not something out there. I mean, after more than 2 decades, at least that period of intense normalized corruption, you have some basically changes in subjectivity, including political subjectivity. And a perfect example are microcredits. The first project they signed a contract with was with a local NGO here from Tuzel to give microloans microcredits to women. And so in a couple of days they signed the contract with the government and did this. But when we look at this literature on microcredits, of how it actually produces subjectivity which is desirable or suitable for austerity capitalism, for hardcore capitalism, the conditions of ruthless, primitive accumulation. Can we, in essence, say that corruption is somehow, because microcredits are a corrupt practice, but in a different sense of corruption, how it corrupts. You as a human being, I don't know, maybe it's the wrong term, but they definitely instead contaminates how you work, how your societies work, how they operate. It's interesting, and this is really cynical. They had this project in '96 with WASCO, and because they were giving to empower women empowerment, to empower women, refugees who had no education, were unemployed now, unable to return, etc. Really poor. So to help them to kind of economically empower and then politically, etc. But through the following system, because they had no guarantees, no official bank, no official bank would give them any loan. So they said, they used this system, I don't know if you know this, they developed it in Africa, Latin America, called solidarity groups. Have you heard about solidarity groups? So basically 5 women get together in a village and they form a solidarity group, and each one is guaranteeing for the other.
that's unbelievable. You know,
20%.
that's
You don't know that microcredits here are 20%.
20%. Because in India,
20%.
you look at like the Gram Bank and, you know, people
And there was
in
this
India.
big bubble of microcredits in the main place. So
That's
basically the
just
poorest
all-
population.
That's all it is. It's shark, loan sharks.
But
Literally.
actually, you recall, but immediately after the war, the commercial banks, I mean, when they had the rates
You
of
had,
20
suddenly you had zillions of microcredit
Can I just
organizations.
ask a technical question?
Yes.
So is it the World Bank who set the interest rates?
Well, yeah, because we, for the first time, wasn't heard of the microcredits. So the model was transplanted here. The World Bank brought
Because the World Bank pays
professional or
the World Bank has 0 or point something interest on the money that it uses for this sort of things. And for the World Bank, and this really, I mean, this has to be, there has to be
but the 20% happening, the 20% that they were getting out of it was used to fund the organization, which was usually an NGO, and sometimes go into new loans. But
either way, it doesn't matter. You
It's-
cannot run a
everybody-
microcredit.
it's everyone's opinion,
20%.
And they
It's
call them
unbelievable.
huh?
They call them in
Zadruga.
Zadruga.
Yes.
They're like, oh, let's use a
They
local
use
term
such a
to.
term like
Yeah.
solidarity and cooperative.
Yeah.
And I
It
think
means motivators.
It's like a,
Kind of units. So, see, this is
Yeah,
the thing as well.
but this is important.
Sorry, but that's pure corruption, actually. That is a prime example.
I mean, this goes back to the problem of like I mean,
But it's a
the
threshold. So
Yeah.
they
I
even have,
read about the
they even have
the
like,
figure.
you have to explore it, they even have like the government, they set up 5 years into that, like the government body to coordinate all the microcredits. The World Bank also financed the coordinating body for all the microcrediting projects in the regions. But I know
You can
because
see the recipe stuff. I know so much search on World Bank. And I'm still like, oh my god.
no, it's just a brief point about language. I mean, it's just sort of following from what you were saying about solidarity groups and, you know, like I mean, this is the problem like also with violence, you know, we, for our left or whatever, we say don't get to define the powerful terms. So, for example, you know, all the terms get taken away from us and turned back. So, you know, we can talk about the communism and capitalism if you want, and that's like a material thing, but also rhetorical reality. And, you know, so for example, like in Britain, David Cameron's that the Tory party's idea of the big society, you know, just taking the term social, you know, and playing off of people's genuine communitarian or you know, desire to help one another, right, but qua human, and making it so then removing state funding for things like libraries, making them run on a volunteer basis, right? That's the big society. So people volunteer for things that were previously provided by the state. The state knowing that these things are going to close or it's very hard to run things on a volunteer basis because it just fucking is, right? Because you know you have to have spare time and money to do it, right? So the libraries then close. Oh, but it wasn't the state directly closing it. It was the lack of communal will or spirit. You know, the big society can see that. It's like
by
no, but
creating
this-
a crisis,
right, but
it's
this
going to
is
disappear.
right. But this is but this is like we lost the word society. I mean, Thatcher at least was more explicit. There was no such thing as society. There were only individuals and their families. But they brought it back only to totally finish it.
And I think
It's the New Deal.
But to this and to what Yasmina said, I think that there's something so insidious that happened to these kind of grassroots war communities and collectivities that were created really to resist the war, and then they were later on forced to register as and NGOs, and then all of this social capital, all of this that they built, and amazing things they did during the war, got just kind of perversely co-opted, and then they had to accept the logic of this World Bank and WASPO, right? I mean, with all these people who did stunning work during the war, I mean, to the point.
But WASPO split in two parts, actually.
Yes.
I know this. It's really interesting. There's me WASPO. But the other project that
they got was by USAID, and it was legal aid for refugees and returnees. They tried to. I was volunteering and working on that project here in Bosnia during the breaks. So basically, they wanted us to prepare all these materials on.
There is a lot of
Sorry, I remembered the Dutch saying.
You'll have to tell us.
Even kijken, ik heb nog een meisje. A bit later. So anyway, we had to have all these promotional materials, and they wanted to explain to people what quality is and all these things. So then part of the democratic education. So they explicitly said no mention of social or economic equality. Equality, just legal equality. They have the right to vote, etc. Just legal and political. No social and economic. So they refused to kind of, in this legal aid, to include social and economic matters. After a while, they realized they really can't, because I forgot to mention what you said in a very weird way. The project stopped, and then it turned into CCI. CCI took it over, kind of with the election regulations, democratization plans, and so on. You know.
I mean, we'll
Anyway, really interesting.
Yes, we really see. I mean, on Saturday there is a Saturday evening. There's a public discussion on the new labour law that's being imposed de facto by the IMF on Bosnia. So yesterday, what was it, Friday? The EU special representative to Bosnia said that the current labour law is too socialist.
He said it's a relic of Titoism.
It's a relic of Titoism. Yeah. So there is this kind of the riding of the wave.
Current labour law is a relic. They said it, but then there is from Titoism.
Well, it's like that body which exists in the European Council, which is basically committed. All that it works on is on eradicating all of the traces of the former socialist, communist, let's say thinking, traces, architecture, setups, management mechanisms, monuments. And then the other thing they're trying to do is the criminalization.
Yes, and victimization. You can just get the whole line of victims of communism.
Oh yeah.
Research it.
Yeah, quite a few Croatian MPs are part of that initiative, and a lot of the obviously Polish and Czech and so on and so forth. Yeah, and this is again, we come back to the Manifest Destiny, because USAID, for example, they are the main implementer of all of this. But this is where, of course, all of these troubles start. So how do you then tell people? How do you teach? How do you explain? How do you shout?
I think Manifest Destiny is that helpful, isn't it?
Forget about Manifest Destiny.
No, but seriously, in the sense that, I think maybe when we're talking about the sort of decisions of global elites, it's not just America. We're talking about.
No, of course not.
And also the Manifest Destiny thing plays into the hands of the term itself in a weird, perverse way. If that makes any sense. I think, in a weird way, we need to be more clinical and specific. Oddly, it's these people doing these things, through the agency. As you were, in fact, in your presentation, being incredibly, this agency, this thing, this, and the whole network. Do you know what I mean? But I'm not sure it's. If we want to talk about the ideological roots or whatever, or the what's behind this.
Yeah, I agree with you to an extent, but I'm becoming just thinking of the whole Islamic threat. I'm kind of thinking that this is why this whole thing has been nagging me for a while. I've been looking at the rollback doctrine, New Deal, Manifest Destiny, and various other things, and I think the problem is that you get certain value systems embedded, But actually the biggest problem about it is something else, is that through this work by all these agencies and corporations, what happens is that they are actually disseminated and reproduced in all sorts of perverted or inverted or very direct forms, but they're around. And I agree with you, yes, actually on one hand it does play back quite badly, but then still I think it's really worth being clinical about it, trying to work out exactly how it actually.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of mean, that there's a kind of, curious, like the most anti-communist internationalism. I mean, when we think about internationalism from a communist point of view, I mean, this is genuine a reality and a project too. But, I mean, now we have the Murrah, or the worst idea of internationalism, which is the international of elites, who use nationalism to, like, in a way, mask their own internationalism. If you see what I mean? Nationalism is useful for them.
Yeah, well, it gets things done. But it's interesting because at the same time, we are almost overlooking certain things, and perhaps that's another thing we need to be thinking about. And there's Jodi Dean was talking about, this despair of the left over the disappearance of any discourses on communism, for example. And she, in fact, pointed out how what is really interesting is that too many people still talk about communism, but from the negative perspective. Now, I'm not so sure that it's very helpful to even talk about communism because, for one, however much I would love the idea, I'm not even sure what it is. I have no idea what this might possibly be. But it's interesting to what extent the negative mobilization is still present and how much it is used as a little whipping tool constantly.
Well, I think it's complicated. I mean, if you ask people to whether they support particular, what we describe as elements of communism, most people will say yes.
Yeah, of course.
Right? So, most people want fairness, equality, redistribution of wealth, income, property, even property, actually. And actually, if you poll people on these questions, even in America, they agree with them, right? And then, so maybe, obviously lots of people have talked about this as a branding exercise, or maybe we call it something else, but actually it's not, the problem is
it
not...
It doesn't matter what you call it again, it's better not to call it somehow, perhaps, and actually be, as you say, clinical and talk about what it really means. And the most important thing is actually thinking about how it would function and what can work, this is, okay, so how can we do this, how can we do that? Certainly more constructive. But the problem is, of course, this is the interesting thing, this is what I mentioned, the thing is, you start doing something like that, and I'm not saying this should stop anybody from doing anything, but you get branded communist, and this is the funniest thing. And then maybe the question then will start arising of saying, actually, so what?
Yeah, exactly.
Fuck you.
I think more people do say that, but
I mean, I think, just drawing on Bosnian experience, there were several, different ways of dealing with this. We had a Communist Party in the recent election that was explicitly called the Communist Party, and there was one way of testing out, how this was going to go. But I think what still has the biggest traction is the insistence on the commons. Really, because what's getting increasingly, in our faces. I mean, now, and it's going to be really interesting to see how this labour law creates a very particular mobilization of certain people who are just kind of, further apart, and how they'll come together to be, people who were considered to be enemies even, before they're going to come together in this hopefully wider front to oppose it. So, and then the question of privatization of water, the destruction of the woods, and privatization of the woods and the cutting of the woods. We saw the detrimental effects of that during the flooding last year. I mean, the landslides and stuff. So I think increasingly that has more traction, more mobilizing power, and as a means of organization, it's proving useful. Which is not to say not to push this, just calling it.
But that's all part of it, And if somebody says, "Hey, you're bringing back communism," then you say, "Yeah, so what?" You have a problem.
So, I mean, the issue, I think, when we talk about anti-austerity, narratives, so for example, I would say, in Britain in the past sort of 5 years, or since what they decided to do. I mean, and obviously, I really want to be clear about the difference between talking about austerity from a core country in the EU, and talking about austerity in like a peripheral country. You know what I mean? Like, and there are different reasons of being against the EU in Britain, most of which are right wing. So I'm not trying to downplay the very real, serious material differences and political differences between the two, I hope. But what's really a difficult question for us is, everyone is in government. There are many anti-austerity positions from a variety of, because everyone is being affected in different ways, right? So just, if you have children, if you're disabled, if you're poor, if you're unemployed, so you have a series of
even if you're single and you work.
Yeah.
And you're not paid very well, that's it.
But what we have then is a kind of negative collective, everyone is defined by their opposition to austerity, right?
Yeah.
Because people are, we have insane levels of food bank use, we have, serious, everywhere, but, these are, ever-increasing sort of polarizations of poverty and life. But the difficult question is then, what then unites all of these negative collectives, right, other than their opposition to X, right?
Exactly, and this is such an important question.
I'm just kind of thinking about the use of food banks. We had the most ridiculous. My short answer would be the reclaiming of the food in that particular situation. You had a very bizarre and very telling example here during the flooding. Emergency supplies were not released, and the minister. There was such horrible flooding that a quarter of the country was underwater. People lost houses. There was no food. There was nothing. And then the minister in Federation, Leanovic, came out and he said, "Well, we are not going to hit the food production people. We are not going to release the emergency funds because people took care of themselves."
Yeah.
And at this point, the only appropriate answer is that you stop doing the substitute performance,
right,
but really go and storm the kind of the storage units and just take the basic supplies and you distribute to the people, right? And you stop doing the substitute performance, because the more you do that, the more you are kind of, put into this, you're just completely dragged, torn apart.
They're relying on people's residual communism to fix their problems. You end up doing. You end up being you basically be the standard of the state because the state is
But actually, we also stopped doing that. During the distribution, we were pushing for supplies to be sent. And that was the remnant of the plenum, I think. There was also.
Did anyone actually storm the storage?
No. But we could actually push. We could direct. You get a phone call. We need water, and then you pick up the call and say, send the truck or water there now, right? No, nothing. It's no questions asked, and that worked.
Maybe this is another point. Maybe this is precisely what needs to be happening a bit more. But certain other things as well.
Yes, because I think there is some sort of, to talk about shame, there's some sort of shame about making these decisions that have consequences if anyone. No, honestly, send us to the water, and you do that. You pick up the phone and you threaten. The threat is you have to send the system water now. Otherwise it's going to be shit, right?
We'll burn more.
Yeah. Well, it's like Minka from Dita Factory saying, going to the cantonal assembly and saying, well, I've got chemicals that I can use that can be used against riot police, and then the assembly representative saying, she's threatening, and she's like, this is not a threat, this is just a possible scenario.
Because it's about resources. They have all the resources and they're relying on other people to be human to stop, so that the state doesn't have to do these things, right? Because, so in a way they know that basically people are fundamentally caring for one another. This is the point that feminism made a really long time ago, or bits of feminism, which is about the limits to how you can go on strike or protest when it comes to questions of social reproduction, right? Because the whole point is you know, okay, you can lay down your tools and go on strike, blah, 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 but if you're looking after people, if it's a question of care, if you're looking after children, you know, I'm not essentializing this, I'm saying, you know, these are jobs that were historically feminized. You know, I'm not making any claim about who or what should be doing them. But, you know, the problem is, if you're looking after a baby, you know, if you're looking after someone who's sick, you know, the question of strike in that situation is impossible or like extremely difficult because you're reproducing like the social, right? And you can't, you know, you're letting
Not just that.
letting
You're
die.
talking about that, exactly. You're talking about life and death.
Exactly. But this is what sustains the everyday. And so
Precisely.
the violence that is, you know, the everyday is subtended by care, right? So the one thing like capitalism can't really admit is the sheer amount of social care that it relies on.
Yes, it draws.
Right, and that's the entire point about unpaid labour, for example. So the provocation of wages for housework is about that. It's like not to
It
be,
shouldn't be a provocation, it should.
but it
should
was. I
happen.
mean,
Yeah, I know.
but you know, like, but it was both, right?
But
So
then on the other hand, you know, it kind of, okay, it doesn't quite happen in Norway, but
right,
there are good examples, really well-working examples where you get certain amount of money for reproductive labour,
Sure.
which is pretty decent. But again, it's not extended properly, it's not actually taking into account all the various aspects of it, so
yeah,
it fails.
it's very like bourgeois,
Yeah.
whatever.
And this is where I'm interested in this kind of, you know, to see where this radical empathy that you're thinking about goes, because you can, I mean, in terms of this care, I mean, you can extend it so much that it becomes completely kind of collective suicidal point
Yeah.
of like empathizing and just
Agreed.
completely disables you. So
Yeah.
how do you know, mobilize? How do you not give up on it? And yet you manage to
But
kind
you
of get out of the orbit of this like self-closed circuit that this kind of care can become solipsistic.
I mean, what do you mean solipsistic?
Well,
I mean,
in terms of like being so closed that this whole violence continues. Like,
Look,
people
yeah, but I think the
continues
point is
forever.
like this is happening all the time. I mean, this is not, you know, something that's like would involve a decision or, you know, it's not like, you know, an imperative to care. It's like, no, care is happening, right? Care all the time. Like, care is not recognised deliberately, explicitly, right? It's absolutely forbidden to talk about it in a certain way because, right, so then it would be like, well, how do we like weaponise care? Like, how do we give care guns
But
or something?
no, I think it's the same thing as the slogan "Not in my name." I mean, that's not the whole thing, right?
So, but
You know,
listen,
that's the- yeah, but that's the only
No, sure, but like, okay, but I mean care in the harshest possible sense. I mean care in, you know, this is the problem. Like when we say words like care, they sound soppy because we are supposed to think that they sound weak.
It's really, I mean,
But they're not. They are the, you know,
Well,
they're
care is what you did. I mean, care is what you did with the guy who was going to be deported. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean that's care.
But right, exactly. And no, but it's, you know, but it's
I
also.
think maybe the point is to kind of turn around and think a lot more naturally about how you make things like this say something. For example, I don't know, it just occurred to me, you know, like you start making subversive, sort of creating subversive actions which are very loud, but you don't abandon them. So I don't know, like a really bizarre example, you know, the free food thing or the junk from the supermarkets. Doing something which is so close to being completely illegal, that is perpetrated solely for the purpose of actually caring for somebody, that you create a lot of attention, you actually draw focus to it. I don't know, but you know, things like that. People actually doing it in a way which really highlights the issue.
Okay,
Constantly.
so
So you're constantly like in their face.
Yeah. Okay. So for example, like people are now being arrested for like buying McDonald's from homeless people, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Alright.
so yeah.
It's stupid. It's
You
just
know, so like you're talking about the criminalisation of care, like in that, you know, in the general sense, like you do an altruistic gesture.
Which means we should all go to McDonald's. We should set up a protest where we all go to McDonald's, like hundreds of us, buy McDonald's for homeless people and get ourselves arrested. This is what we should be doing, you know? This is the sort of thing we should do. Right, give me a criminal record for buying McDonald's for some homeless guy or girl. You know? It's the sort of thing, this is the law, because it's such an absurd piece of legislation, or whatever, maybe it's not totally inactive, but is certainly used.
Yeah.
It's the absurdity that has to be highlighted, and you have to actually really make a stance and say, right, cool, let's go with this.
Rule of law. I mean, there's very little left that we can use as a defence, but certainly in Britain there's still the possibility of saying prevention of greater harm. You know, this is still a legal defence. I was talking about the other day. So, for example, one of the only good cases that, victories recently was women broke into an air hangar and smashed up a Learjet that was going to be sent to Indonesia to be used in East Timor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they smashed it up, they broke it, sorry, they rendered it inoperative, and the judge actually says, I accept this argument, like you prevented a greater harm. You know, and like, so maybe, do you know what I mean?
I'm sure, in fact,
use
I'm actually
these
sure, yeah.
arguments
Maybe this
against
is the thing.
themselves.
Maybe we should speak to some of the barristers who have held it and some other people and actually find these
You need
precedents.
less lawyers.
Like quite a few.
Right? You need, I mean, these people are so important. I mean, not just individually, but also for thinking about.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, I also
To come up with ideas, actually. And in a way, you come up with ideas. You find a really stupid law, a stupid piece of legislation, which then you find precedents to fight it with, and then you actually deliberately break that piece of legislation and end up creating...
You don't even need to deliver. I mean, you know, like,
It's probably
you get
very
arrested
easy.
like we're doing fucking nothing these days, so. You know, but yeah.
We don't have too much to choose from when it comes to lawyers and legal aid.
No, sure.
Definitely 15 years ago the situation was better. Before they invaded the so-called judicial reform, the international communication, they admitted gloriously failed, but it really devastated jurisprudence and judicial landscape in Bosnia, and human rights organizations really kind of all got into policy making, etc. It's really hard to find lawyers here, good lawyers, who are dealing with human rights and
But you've gone a bit beyond that. This is the interesting thing.
I'm just commenting on
No,
that.
I mean,
to realize something that was really very difficult for us.
And then the resources are.
So you had to go to Britain to get help.
Yes, and it's really about the resources that you have, all this expertise you have. It was such hard work to try to get these, like tons of human rights organizations interested in these workers' issues, right? So, and that's why we had to have recourse to human rights lawyers in the UK.
Okay,
Yeah, but they can't help much on a day-to-day basis. Of course, if you have some kind of pool of people here and then you have close collaboration, if you don't have the barristers here.
What about young kids, you know, who've just graduated?
Now,
People like that.
what counts?
What about Carolina? So here's Carolina, so she's one.
Yeah,
You know,
it's impossible, completely impossible. Because, I mean, first of all, the education system is completely, scrapped.
So you don't get taught enough.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
would
you don't
actually have to re-educate yourself.
I mean, it's not only about lawyers. I mean, this is not a problem restricted only to...
Yeah, of course.
But you don't have practical education, and how can you actually work on a case, like, if you have no experience? And, I mean, if we are talking about DITA, we're not talking about this kind of some kind of a civil case like a minor. We're actually talking about,
What about databases over the past 25 years? I mean, is there like, court cases, legal databases, court cases, documentation? It doesn't exist, no?
But, I mean,
Working in a court of DIH, you don't have databases.
Of course not.
That's probably the best resource
Start
tool.
But really, the lawyers of human rights, which are specialized in human rights, are the least paid. So, if you were a lawyer, if you now graduate fresh from college, you would go in some
Corporate.
kind of,
But actually, that's precisely, I think, the sort of person one needs in this case. You don't need a human rights lawyer. You actually need a corporate lawyer. That's the best person to fight in this corner, because that's the sort of person... They know, because they know all the tricks. What you need them to do is find all the holes.
it was difficult to find criminal lawyers
Yeah,
and
that's
corporate
right.
lawyers
Who would like to-
depending whether it's beaten up or somebody beaten up by the police and harassed by the police. It's difficult to find a lawyer, criminal or corporate, without paying huge amounts of money, because how they operate, these lawyers, is that they will probably get see their interest elsewhere, especially in these cases like Vita. Who else can pay for more to screw up? And actually, Vita had experience with lawyers like that.
Yeah, I know, but I was just kind of vainly hoping that perhaps there might be somebody who actually has some like a conscience.
That's what I think.
You know, but sometimes, ask Tita Tenich, maybe she knows something.
Sorry.
Imagine. But then, on the other hand, you know, if you get to the stage where you understand the basic procedures, there is actually a lot one can do, because you are not, in fact, obliged to use a solicitor or a lawyer in Bosnia, as far as I understand the law. And if you have a little pool of volunteers who have enough training, I'm happy to help with the investigative side of it, you know, and you get all the information that you need, and then prepare.
No, but like, you know, we legal aid cuts, you know, everyone's representing themselves now, but you know, you're just like triply fucked if you do that. It's not just having the, you know, marshalling the material, it's everything about.
Britain has a very different system, trust me. I've had
No, but it's the same problem. Like, if you represent yourself, like, you know,
They
you're
have to know
fucked.
the system.
It's really hard to do well. Like, nobody wins that case when they represent themselves.
Actually, you know what? I know an organization, I know a couple of very conscientious people in Croatia. And perhaps, maybe it would be an idea to speak with them. Because they will understand certainly the basics, and they will know something about the legal system. They'll be at least able to advise. They won't be able to listen.
I think you need a legal defence committee if you don't have one already.
Yeah. I don't know.
It needs to be like, I don't know, an integral part of like defending, you know, anyone who's involved in actions.
Well, I think at the same time, you need to train people alongside these kind of defenses, like, you know, how to
Absolutely.
recruit.
But it's true, there should be a Bosnia-wide legal defense committee. There should.
Yeah.
That's important.
Like, we have that legal defence monitoring around, which is small, but
Helsinki human rights were used to do things like this 10 years ago, where they've been smashed to pieces.
Well, they smashed themselves to pieces.
Smashed and smashing, self-smashing and being smashed.
Yeah, well, most of the NGO said that it had been adequately.
Correct.
I mean, if they accept it completely. Well, that's the same. It's really interesting how the case of the protests show almost all. Bosnia has around 10,000 NGOs.
No. It has around 11,000 NGOs on paper, but it has active 6,000
Well,
NGOs.
yeah, so but I mean, you know, 6,000 active and like 11,000 registered.
it's still insane.
A single, like a single.
No, they're not active. There are no funds, like no projects for about 5-6 years.
Yeah.
And
And a lot of those are the kind of dodgy NGOs to which money is loaned and stuff. I mean, that's,
Talking about active, not registered.
yeah, but okay, I mean, tons of NGOs, and they were all silent. Almost all of them were silent on the protest.
Really.
But it was so interesting. And if you take the track record of what they were getting the funding for, like in the past, like 5 years, to effect social change, right?
You have to be a bit more nuanced there. There are loads of people who work in NGOs, but no NGO as an organisation came out in support of the plenum. But on the other hand, that was also rejected, not by us in Tuzla, but by many other plenums, including Sarajevo, who said no political parties, no NGOs, people are la la la. No.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is that really shows that, you know, how it kind of, it from starting with Boston, that did such great things, right? Starting with all these people who were doing the great things, and how they got spent, like how they got ossified as like yeah. And then there's nothing you can do with NGOs now, right?
But you have now. You just. I mean, the thing is, I think the point is, okay, there is a need for something that is like a little defense committee. One has to be set up. Young girls have to be trained. Something has to be done like that. I think it's really important to think in those terms. To say, okay, let's fucking self-organize. Maybe that's it. It needs to happen. We need to find people, network.
But it's a constant self-organization.
But the thing is, let's try and come up with a system in which we are able to communicate more often and really like bring people together and then see who can do what and spread out.
I'll give you the example now. So currently we are working, in this week alone, we're working on two big things, like this labor law, and all of a sudden, because they dictate the terms, they all of a sudden pushed the deadline. It was going to be voted on the 1st of August, which is, I mean, yes, today's what? The 27th of July. It's it doesn't give you much. No. And look, everybody's on holiday. And this is, it's going to be an emergency session of the government. Then we have the higher education law. That's called legally. The 1st of August is, and then all of a sudden you're finding yourself being surrounded by like 5 different flames kind of attacking you. I mean, you don't know where to turn your head around.
Yeah.
So, and then plus, I mean, that's, and then you're like trying to prioritize what's burning more, how you can organize more people at the same time to have a bigger impact. How do you focus on a very particular thing that's threatening your safety and security, and think about Urban being one of the places that's attacked, by the police, and it's just like, well, there's the whole thing about under the guise of music being too loud. There are things that the police are becoming intimidating. So so it's just you're being stretched to the point. The capacities are it's exactly. It's like Chinese split can that you have to do it. That's like your limbs are all over the place. So
Chinese split, multi-dimensional space.
And you kind of have to simultaneously work on so many levels, and and there's only so much that ever think about it. People always already do 3 to 4 jobs to be able to kind of sustain themselves. I mean, that's what happened to us during Plenum. It was like living 2 separate lives. Doing a little bit of teaching, teaching about whatever you teach about Plenum, right? If it's Renaissance poetry or whatever. And then you go there and practice. I mean, that's what you do. You teach literary theory. It's like, the progress. It's like, oh, there's this structure. In this poem we can see, right? So, but, no, it's true. No, it's really true.
Actually, there are no classes for the first 2 weeks of the plenum because of the whole situation, so that was good.
That was great. The teaching had to resume, and then you're like,
When I was in Chile, there was a research that
It's a war story involving camps as well.
I remember going to, I don't know what it was. I think it was something called Women's Court or something. Yeah, so it was a presentation in the library of the Women's Court. And what was really interesting then is that a lot of women who are now retired came, and after the end of the presentation, all of these women actually said, look, I really want to help. I have nothing to do. I kind of do some cooking, I care for family in the morning and stuff like that. But you know what? I have the afternoons. Would you like me to come and do something? So I was just thinking, whether it's possible. I know it's possible. But maybe
the question is not whether possible, whether we should, but how.
Yeah, exactly.
Something could work. I'm very familiar with that.
yes, exactly. Heroism of labour. Yeah. What does it mean?
But if people are prepared, and everybody's already putting in free labor, then maybe they're not. I mean, I'm just talking about this example. I saw this woman saying, please,
No, I was really taken by this Affiché, like syntagm, heroism of labour, and how, what's the truth of that syntagm, how it needs to be presented again as the heroism, it's like the heroic act of labour in these kind of self-organized units. What kind of heroism is it? Maybe it's trying to resuscitate the spirit of heroism in this type of labour, of helping, assisting, and start branding it as the wrong word, but calling it that. Actually, because think about the floods. When the plenum called the emergency meeting during the floods, we had most of the people who called, who arrived to go and help, were like 18, 19. I mean, that was such a surprise. Yes. I mean, there were 150 people in the meeting immediately wanting to go, to be deployed that very evening and just go. And
yes, in emergency, in disaster. Did you go without that day to day, when you don't have the peak, this peak of affect, let's go and help, let's do something. I mean, it's not so obvious to you, the kind of learning happening around. How do you do that?
How do you sustain the everyday growth?
How do you sustain this?
I think maybe the secret is in organizing it well, distributing the work that needs to be done cleverly, so it's not overburdening anybody, but it's well structured, so it's clear what needs to be done. I mean, it's quite a job, even just to design this.
Yes, you need
But you know what? Come on. think about the Kozara celebration in July.
They started.
Yeah, and I remember talking with Dražen and Emil, we got drunk one night a year or so ago. This is when I was proposing that we do the thing in Prijedor, for the 1st of May. And they said, well, actually, let's go and do something for Dan Borci. This is fighters, the day of the fighters in the World War II. Yeah? And so from 4 or 5 people, this thing grew into quite a lot, and there was a lot of work that had to be put into it in advance, and it just went on and on and on. But I also remember speaking, for example, with Hanna Obradović, and she was telling me also how they've been trying to actually create some kind of system and mobilize each other, and the way in which they actually responded to the floods, that was really interesting as well, how to organize themselves. Okay, this is Sarajevo, but what I'm trying to say, you get it in Banja Luka, people do it. You get it in Prijedor perhaps to a lesser extent because of the problems there. You get it in Sarajevo. So it's not as if it's impossible, and it seems like there is something brewing. People are becoming more and more interested in doing this, helping or whatever, organizing themselves, pushing.
But it's also what was important in that example is really to create, in this Benjaminian way, the true state of emergency, to create a conflict, to enter into a conflict, to kind of jumpstart.
Just to make people realise that the everyday is the emergency.
Exactly. It's urgent. The need to do
But
something.
it's
It's not
staging
hard to
this.
get people to realise that actually, I think.
But that's what the protests were, right? I mean, it was the attempt to make the slow disaster of poverty and unemployment into a spectacular moment like the floods. To basically say, this is a moment
Did you
that rises to that level of, that requires that kind of a response.
Safely with that side, we can kind of wrap it up for tonight and move either stay here.
What a conclusion.
And exactly, it's been a beautiful conclusion. It's a promise that you make to yourself. So, on that note, thank you. Well, we begin tomorrow at 10, so we'll try to arrive here with Anna Dasovic, And the working group jokes for genocide.
Yeah.
Yes?
Good.
Great.
Did we tap you before?
No, you could.
No.